Well, more harsh words today from the UN Secretary General about climate inaction. The Canadian government has pledged to lower emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030 and to achieve net zero by 2050. And that's all part of the larger plan to transform the economy away from a dependence on fossil fuels. For reaction to the latest international climate report and to look ahead to the budget, I'm joined by Steven Guilbeault, Canada's Minister of the Environment. Minister, good to see you again. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you, Peter.
The UN Secretary General calls them empty pledges, a file of shame, accuses political and industry leaders of lying about climate pledges. These are members across the international community he was referring to. Do you believe that criticism applies to Canada?
I mean, we have to be honest with each other here. Canada doesn't have a very good track record when it comes to fighting climate change. We've announced over the years and the decades, really, a number of targets that we never met, simply because we never really tried. But now, for the first time, we have a plan. But not only a plan that's theoretical, but it's grounded in reality. We've already started deploying it by putting in place, I'd say, a good balance of carrots and sticks. We're making investments, record level investments in clean technologies, in transit, in electrification, in clean technologies. But also, we're putting in place regulations. We've used legislative tools like the price on pollution, which is already one of the highest in the world in Canada. And we're an oil and gas producers. Not a lot of oil and gas producers out there have a price on pollution. Our biggest trading partner, the U.S., doesn't have one. So I think now people can have trust that we will get there, but there's a lot of heavy lifting ahead of us.
Okay, let me. So you talked about oil and gas production. The report says what's really required to get through an increasingly narrow window now to get this right is much deeper cuts in fossil fuel emissions. But the government still provides billions of dollars a year in subsidies to the fossil fuel sector in Canada, and oil production will continue to rise in coming years. So how does that jibe with the pledge to move away from a carbon economy and to do it more quickly?
Well, two things. I mean, on fossil fuel subsidies, you're absolutely right, which is why we committed during the last election campaign to phase those out in Canada 2 years earlier than our G20 partners. So the target for G20 is to phase them out by 2025. We've committed to doing that by 2023. And in fact, you may have noticed that it's part of the agreement with the NDP, number one. Number two, as you know, constitutionally, the federal government can regulate or legislate pollution, but we can't regulate production. Production of natural resources is a clear provincial jurisdiction in our Constitution. But what we've said that we would do, and in fact, we are already doing it, we are in the process of reducing methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. We're on track to meeting almost a 50% reduction in this form of pollution by 2025. And we'll go to 75% reduction of that form of pollution by 2030. And we've also announced that we would be putting a cap on the emissions of the oil and gas sector. No other countries in the world has made that commitment.
When are we going to see that cap, and what level is it going to be capped at? Today's output, the output a year from now, 2 years from now, 4 years ago? What's the cap going to be based on?
So I think there's two questions there: when and what. So I'll start with the what. What we said during the campaign is that we would cap those emissions at current levels. Obviously, when we come up with the exact mechanism we will use, we'll have to define exactly what do we mean by current levels. Is it 2021? Is it 2022? I can assure you it's not 2025 or 2024. So it's around now, basically. And number two, it can take a lot of time at the federal level to produce new legislation or new regulations. The commitment I've made is to do that in a matter of months, most likely towards the end of the year, which is a groundbreaking level. Like to go so fast is almost unheard of at the federal level, and frankly, even at the provincial level, to be able to develop either legislation or regulation at this speed.
Do you believe you can approve a major new fossil fuel project, such as the Bay du Nord project off Newfoundland, and still reduce emissions from the fossil fuel sector?
I can't comment on Bidge Nord because I'm still reviewing all of the material, and I have said I would make a decision by the middle of the month. But when we presented our plan last year, our emission reduction plan, we based that plan on a number of data sources, including the Canadian Energy Regulator. It's an independent regulator from the federal government. In its last report, they say that the production of oil and of gas will continue to increase between now and 2030. But what we said and what we presented last week in our plan is that we can still achieve our 2030 targets by going after the emissions. So regardless of which project goes ahead or doesn't go ahead, as we attack more and more the emissions and as we work with the sector through a combination of regulations and investment to ensure that if there's an increase in production, even if there's no increase in production, frankly, we have to make those emissions go down, and that's the task at hand for us.
A couple of quick areas to deal with in the time we have left. The IPCC report today does support the use of carbon capture technologies to pull carbon out of the air. Your climate plan teased a new investment tax credit for developing carbon capture and storage technology. Do you expect the details in the budget of how much that credit will be? Because, as you know, industry is saying, look, if it's not a credit of 50 to 75% of cost, it's not going to work. So do you agree with that number?
That would be a good question to ask the finance minister. Unfortunately, I'm just your humble environment and climate change minister, so I don't know what will be in the budget. We have committed in the 2021 budget to come out with the details this year on that tax credit, and on that particular technology, we were very careful in our plan. Only 5% of the reduction, the anticipated reduction in the oil and gas sector in the overall plan comes from that technology. So we're banking on it, but we're doing it in a very careful manner.
Let's finish on this. Today, the Ontario government became the latest province to cut its share of provincial gas taxes. It will drop by 11 cents a litre starting July 1st for 6 months to help Ontarians deal with the higher cost of living, and it will have an effect effectively of blunting the increase in the federal carbon tax. So do you support provinces cutting gasoline taxes, or does that undermine the role of and the intent of higher carbon pricing?
It does goes against our efforts to fight climate change, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we've gone through a pandemic. There is a terrible crisis happening right now in Ukraine. We're seeing inflation, but all of these crises will go. And climate change will still be there. And climate change is killing people in Canada. 700 deaths last year in BC alone related to the heat domes. A 200% increase in heat-related deaths. So
you wish provinces were not reducing their gas taxes?
Exactly. There are other things that provinces could do to both help customers face inflation as well as fighting climate change. They're just going for the easy solution and probably a one that is short terms in terms of political popularity.
All right. Time is short for us tonight. Steven Guilbeault, Minister of the Environment, thanks so much for your time and take care.
Thank you very much. You too, Peter.